After working in local news for a number of years, I got hired at CNN back when it was a news organization, worked there from 1990 to 93, went on to be an investigative reporter at CBS News. I also hosted a news magazine at the same time for PBS. And now I host an independent show called Full Measure. A lot of people, if they know me, know that I quit my contract ahead of the contract expiration at CBS because I was sort of on the leading edge of discovering this new trend in journalism where they started to want us to uh, not give factually correct information in our stories and to censor things. It hit me probably first as an investigative reporter. And after trying for a couple of years to work within the system, I decided I couldn't do it. And now on my independent show, Full Measure, I still am doing that just plain old, good old fashioned journalism, which is now sort of a novelty. I've interviewed him many times, and I think the crew that came with me also noticed the same thing. He seemed extraordinarily relaxed and confident and upbeat. So that was my takeaway. It's funny, it's sort of a Rorschach test when I looked at the responses to the interview. The Trump deranged crazy Tommy Christopher at Mediaite said that this was Trump admitting defeat and how dejected he was, admitting that he was going to lose. You know, and other people saw or thought he was confident. My read is, but I also had the benefit of talking with him before and after the interview a little bit.
Right.
He's very upbeat and confident and very relaxed. You know, I ask challenging questions of the people that I interview, but I don't debate them. That's not my style. I want viewers to be able to hear a full answer. And when he is not debated, particularly fake fact checked, as so often happens with journalists, he's very comfortable.
Right.
And he has the chance to express more, and then you as the viewer can decide what to make of his answers, which is how I think it ought to be. This was an assignment from CBS News as an investigative reporter. Take a look at the restart of the smallpox vaccine program after 9/11, when there was fear that smallpox could be used as a biological weapon. And I start the book talking about that because I think I was at a place where many Americans were, maybe less so after COVID, but I never questioned the medical establishment. I thought your doctors had the best information, peer-reviewed published studies were true, federal health agencies would never lie. And little by little, as I covered these stories, I discovered they are very similar to other scandals I've covered, where there are whistleblowers, government corruption, cover-ups, financial ties, and really unbelievable ethically corrupt connections between the media, politics, and in this case, the medical establishment that I posit result in making us sicker and sicker, even as we've never spent more money on health and pills and doctors and insurance. It did. I think in retrospect, we have learned, those of us who've looked in the industry, the push to get everybody insured is almost like the push to get everybody a loan for college. It results in allowing the vested interest to charge whatever they want and know that they'll get paid. And it resulted in escalating the costs of all of our health system rather than making it affordable. So the idea that everybody would have insurance, and a lot of it subsidized by us, the government or federal taxpayers, means that there are no market forces at play. The government, which benefits from donations from the medical industry, sets the prices that they're allowed to charge. So they get donations to set nice high prices to cover certain procedures and pills and treatments and so on. And then the nice high prices that they charge, which would be unaffordable to most people without insurance,
Right.
are paid when with the appearance that it's not costing as much because our out of pocket is $15, without realizing that, of course, our premiums are high and that we're all paying more in taxes to cover these costs for Medicare and Medicaid and so on. So the system, the analysts that I trust that have been proven correct over the many years say we cannot survive. Our financial system will break under the weight of what we're spending on healthcare, even as we're growing sicker and sicker as a result. Well, think of how corrupted this is, that we are not considered the customer, we as the patient. We are considered sort of just somebody to be told what to do. The insurance companies think the doctors are the customer. The doctors end up sort of thinking the insurance companies and the pharmaceutical industry are their customer. We're just sort of ancillary. I mean, I know people experience this on a daily basis. My husband needs a cardiac procedure, and because the hospital/doctor couldn't get in touch with the insurance company through some snafu, the tail was wagging the dog. They were telling me we couldn't schedule it, and I was saying, but I'll pay cash if I have to. Can you
Right.
give me a cash estimate? This is a medical necessary procedure. Now, weeks have gone by, they would not do it. So here it is that the process is dictating the medical care rather than the medical care dictating what happens. And I think, again, this is experienced by people on a daily basis. It's very perverted. Pretty early because I lucked upon some great sources inside the government, including some fellows who worked on the original vaccines, a year plus before they came out, or about a year before they came out. And they told me that they wouldn't work very well or last very long because they've never been able to make an RNA vaccine that works well or lasts long. That's why we don't have a vaccine for AIDS after all these years.
Right.
So when then it was pressed as 100% effective and all of these things, I knew something was off, that it wouldn't be. They had also told me that boosters would be needed for the people who it was determined would need the shot, which they didn't think at the time would be healthy people, regular people.
Right.
For those who got it, they said because it wears off quickly, would need boosters. When that was, public health officials pretended that was a big surprise when that was necessary. I thought, okay, something's wrong there.
Right.
And then with the whole cover up of the obvious probable origins of it, and I knew pretty early on and published the grant numbers, in fact,
Right.
that show we funded gain of function research and that Dr. Fauci was an approving authority for this, and yet was publicly not disclosing that as he tried to disparage the origins of COVID being the Wuhan lab. I saw that there was the appearance of corruption there. So pretty much every step of the way. And I dissect in the book how when hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin were being rightly explored as generic medicines that could potentially be repurposed, which is what you always do with a novel virus. It's the fastest way to try to handle it is if you can find existing safe and effective medicines that could be repurposed. Then all of a sudden that was controversialized, that it was crazy to look at these things. And so all those things added up very quickly. This started to look like many other medical scandals that I had covered. Well, some years ago, the former head of the New England Journal of Medicine did an interview with me, Dr. Marcia Angel, where she said that much of the literature is not to be trusted, including that in the New England Journal of Medicine. And she outlined how she tried to keep out the pharmaceutical influence in dishonest studies that the journal was being asked to publish, and that she lost the battle.
Wow.
So around that time, and we're talking, 20 years ago,
Yeah.
shortly after that, the current editor of the British journal Lancet wrote a similar editorial that said something like science has taken a turn toward the dark side. He too said that much, if not most, of the literature in these peer-reviewed published journals is not to be believed. And there's much data that has come across since then that shows the journals often act as little more than propaganda machines for the pharmaceutical industry in ways that are invisible to doctors who rely on this literature because it's not disclosed. It's not like they realize they're looking at ads or they're looking at articles that are ghost written by the pharmaceutical industry because they're signed by real doctors that look like they're independent. There are just so many problems with how studies are done and which ones are published and which ones will never see the light of day.
Right.
And lastly, I'd like to just mention the whole decision on what studies are funded by the government pharmaceutical complex means we're getting sicker and sicker, because if there's not a profitable pill or money to be made at the end of the line, then some of our most consequential health problems are not being funded for study because there's no special interest that wants the answer. Well, I think Kennedy knows more than any politician of his stature about how the corruption works and these medical ties. And obviously, I'm not an organizational expert. I don't know how government can be fixed. I think he might have some idea of how to chip away. But on an individual level, we have to understand that most of the narratives that we are being told by mainstream media and by our own doctors, sadly, are probably not accurate or not the whole story. So start with that point.
Right.
And there are ways you can look for better resources. Born out of COVID, thankfully, there are groups of independent doctors that were very esteemed and well published and well regarded pioneers who have broken away and are developing other resources like the FLCCC.
Right.
You can find them online, and other places where you can find a different viewpoint about some of the problems that we're suffering and maybe courses of treatment that are, off the narrative. You want to look at that too.
Right.
And then I say there are ways to hold the feet to the fire. If we demand different kind of treatment from our doctors who like to push us through the system without listening to us or understanding the whole picture or looking at alternate things, Find another doctor or demand that your doctor put a study in front of him to read that's off the narrative that you found that could be meaningful. If we demand better treatment, they'll have to supply it at some point.
Right.
And then lastly, in terms of finding better information, I do have in the last chapter some very specific ideas for who you can turn to. And for me as a journalist, and probably for you too, it boils down to believing the people who proved correct on related topics in the recent past.
Yes.
You see the media continuing to quote the same wrong people who gave out disinformation and wrong information over and over again during COVID. I don't rely on those people for my accurate and reliable information. I look back at the track record and see who proved correct. And it's pretty easy to do. There are some places you can turn to for that in the future. So, well, you will see a handful of common sources for all kinds of things regarding manipulating our information on medical issues and other issues too. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, also Craig Newmark of Craigslist is a huge funder. And people don't understand they're not just funding directly medical causes that you can trace a line to. They're also funding these fake fact check groups, and funding journalism groups like the Columbia School of Journalism and Poynter Institute, and making it where journalists turn to these groups that they believe may be providing independent information, but are serving as no more than a publicity arm of the pharmaceutical industry to debunk things that are actually true and to censor things they don't want you to learn about. It's really a ubiquitous thing that I think most people don't know is going on behind the scenes. Well, that is a very well orchestrated and well-funded campaign. It's been going on for some time, but I mark a really big turning point in that in 2015 with the entrance of Donald Trump onto the political stage. People think they hate Donald Trump because of his mean tweets, but I argue they hate Donald Trump because there was a very well orchestrated campaign of narratives put out by the special interests who didn't want a Trump in there because he's not beholden to the same pharmaceutical and money interests. So both Republican and Democrat establishment figures alike who are funded by these groups you're talking about did not want a Trump in there, and they executed these campaigns and they put a ton of money into them, and they exist today, and they were morphed into the COVID campaigns that we saw to debunk true information and to pump up medicine and vaccines. So, you know, I don't know how to, I tried to give some perspective in the book of how much there is of this, so that virtually everywhere you look and every nonprofit that sounds like it does one thing may actually do the opposite and be funded by the similar handful of interests that we're talking about. Well, I've said that for a long time about the same issues and even pre-existing that there are clear hallmarks of psychological operation warfare. They understand the language and the buzz phrases to use that seem to resonate with a susceptible public, at least a huge portion of the public. And it's executed in a way that I think to some of us who've been looking into this, it becomes a little more obvious. You know, we see it, but clearly it's become a very effective way of doing business for the people that have studied exactly how to get to people and get their narratives across and make people become zealots for or against the thing that, you know, these manipulators want. Some of them, I think, for sure. And I have learned that whereas I used to, I guess, hold the medical profession into this esteemed category. My dad's a doctor, my brother's a doctor, they're good doctors, there are many good doctors. But I think I've learned, and it was shocking at first, that some top public health officials and esteemed doctors will tell outright lies and will do things against the public health and the public interest. That's really hard for most people to wrap their heads around. They just can't believe that that would be the case. I didn't either 20-something years ago. And it just didn't make any sense. And there are so many instances, some of which I've outlined in the book, but so many documented instances, you have to come away once you've studied it with the notion that it's not uncommon to have these ethically conflicted things going on inside science and medicine. And I think that's hard to swallow, but once you understand that's the way it works, you look at things a lot differently. I haven't explored that in depth where I can speak with authority on it, but I will say that something that you touch upon that I think is very important is that most of the government pharmaceutical money goes through universities. I call it legal laundering of taxpayer money to promote a certain thing. And you talk about the siloing of information, that began a good 25 years ago in earnest when the pharmaceutical industry that was paying for the study started to understand that Used to be researchers would publish positive or negative studies.
Right.
Well, the pharmaceutical industry didn't want the negative studies published, and they realized if they could silo the information and even the data at different research centers, and no single researcher had the entire picture of what was going on, then nobody could go rogue and publish the study after the fact that the pharmaceutical industry didn't want published. They also have begun to make such tight controls over the contracts that the researchers are not permitted to talk about the studies or to publish them if they don't come out the right way. So the public doesn't understand. You may get one good, slightly good sounding study about X selling injection or drug, but
Right.
what you may not know is there were 10 showing that they were harmful or caused cancer or something else that were never published and will never be published.
Right.
So for everything you see, there's a reason you're being shown that particular study, and there's probably a lot of other things that you're not being told about. No, and I think it's a brilliant question that outsiders like you and I think is obvious to ask. And I asked the same thing. I did a story on this. I spoke to many independent researchers, and to a man, there isn't one that thought we should be doing research in partnership with the Chinese over anything for the reasons you described. I think one person I quoted in the book said someone's IQ dropped sharply when that decision was made. We all know, without knowing very much, that it's ill-advised to do business with the communist Chinese, that they are in partnership with them. For every civilian research initiative they have, there's a secret military application. We know the things they're trying to do. It's been publicly reported that they want to create diseases that impact only certain races that are very targeted. Why we would do that, I think, can be explained in part by we were not being allowed to do that sort of gain of function research in the United States. It was temporarily, considered too risky. We didn't have the proper controls in place, but we were able to conduct it in a different lab that we were helping with in China. And it was I don't know if a lot of people know this, to come up with a vaccine. So the research that may have led to the release of the pandemic virus was being conducted in order to come up with a profitable vaccine. And to come up with a profitable vaccine, they were taking a virus, a bat coronavirus that was not harmful to people, and they made it harmful to people. Gain of function research to make the vaccine that ultimately likely resulted in the pandemic, for which they had no effective vaccine. It's so crazy when you think about it. And I think Dr. Fauci and those who funded the research, I believe, understood on the front end the implication of this, what I just told you.
Yeah.
They were saying that this couldn't have come from the lab. They were simply defending their own allegedly corrupt role in creating the pandemic, as they were speaking to it. It doesn't. I trace some of that change to some changes in laws. I believe it was under the Obama administration. It wasn't intended to do what it did, but it made it less profitable for the drugs to be made in Puerto Rico, which is the US territory where a lot of our biological and drugs were made. Well, as it happens, in the past 5 to 6 years, Puerto Rico is making a comeback for some of that. And I visited and did a story on this. They are trying to come up with generic biologicals to manufacture there and trying to gen that back up on US soil, as they should, for the reasons you mentioned. We have set ourselves up. Every independent analyst has been calling this out for over a decade. We are almost wholly reliant on China for so much of our medicine. They simply need pull a pin at the right moment. And we're really in trouble in terms of our healthcare in this country. And yet our political leaders seem, they talk about it, but they're not doing anything about it. Well, I doubt that's going away. And I've reported on that quite a bit because they give so much money, the pharmaceutical industry, to our political figures, both parties, to help influence that those rules could be amended so that they could advertise. You're right. I think we're one of only 2 countries, modern countries, that allow pharmaceutical prescription drugs to be advertised for the reasons that it's not considered something people should be kind of self-prescribing and asking about. And it's not that people go in and say, put me on a particular drug in most cases, like you said, but the industry's internal documents show they know that if they can simply get you inside the doctor's office to say, I'm having trouble sleeping, or I'd like to lose weight, that you will be prescribed the latest marketed drug to the doctor's office. So they just have to get you through the door of the doctor's office, through the threshold, and let him say, are you having trouble sleeping? Like, now all of a sudden they're going to ask you these questions if you don't bring them up. And then they have the opportunity to send you a prescription of the latest drug that's being marketed. But number two, whether or not these drugs even are for you, they exert great control over the media and what the media will and won't report, because the media fully understands, and the reporters who work there, where their bread is buttered, and they know they can't go after anymore some of these big stories that are so impactful to so many Americans. Well, I'm simply helping promote it because I know a lot of the people that are taking part. That's the extent of my involvement. But I will tell you, as I've written about recently, I think there's an important political thing happening in this country that the establishment, and it's happening around the world, epic battle between what I'm about to say and the establishment parties. There's almost a new political party that's formed, and it consists of people both on the left and the right. We'll talk about journalists that consider themselves pretty much on the far left, like Glenn Greenwald. People like Schellenberger, who I think used to kind of consider himself more liberal, although he's been conservative on climate issues more recently. It's Elon Musk, who says he's always voted for Democrats before. It's Bobby Kennedy Jr., who left the Democrat Party when they rigged it where he couldn't run, in the party. It's Tulsi Gabbard, who is a Democrat from Hawaii, who's joined the Trump team, basically. It's a group of people who still differ on some key issues like abortion and climate change and environment, perhaps, but they all see a more immediate and pressing concern. And this is what I think this rally is about that's coming up. It's government censorship and overreach. It's the control of the narrative and our health in a way that's making us sicker. And I think these people have decided that is a more urgent and pressing concern that has to be addressed. And it's a formidable group of people willing to gather together and question the establishment. And like I say, the establishment folks will do anything to try to discredit and stop these people. But I think ultimately, that's the way that change can come, through the pressure of joining forces in this way. Well, here's the frightening thing I think of. The fact that we even have a discussion as to what should and shouldn't be censored. The fact that many in the media are cheering on censorship of certain things. It shouldn't even be on the table. This country was founded on the idea that the government can't do that, even if the information's false, by the way. So the whole notion that, hey, they're censoring even true information. Yes, that's really bad, but that almost implies that they should be censoring false information. And I think we've gotten this conversation going in the country where a lot of people think that they want the false, someone else to decide what's false, and then they want not to be able to see that. They've been brainwashed into thinking that's a good thing. And with the data stuff, I've heard young people for 20 years after I was spied on at CBS News by the government, I started to hear people say, as more and more people were exposed having been spied on, well, they can spy on me, I have no secrets. And I'm thinking they lulled us into this notion, now we accept there's a certain level of spying. Oh yeah, of course the government spies on us. This is a non-starter. They're not allowed to do that. They've granted themselves authorities that they shouldn't be permitted. Congress hasn't stopped them. It just, we're just at a very dangerous place in terms of what I think this country is supposed to be about, and what many in the public are accepting as something that the government should do. I think it's been going on since before 9/11, and there's some evidence of, stories I reported and told about the big hand of government trying to do what seemed like illegal stuff with surveilling government citizens even prior to that. But certainly they allowed themselves in the post 9/11 environment, even without a congressional vote or disclosure, to have far more latitude in what they were doing. For a while, I'm not sure if it's 2 hops now or 3 hops, but they were permitting themselves, the intelligence agencies. This is how they got Donald Trump, in my view, during the 2015-2016 campaign. If they could just find someone around Donald Trump, because they knew a court probably wouldn't give them a wiretap on Donald Trump, but they found Carter Page, someone who had never even spoken to Trump, and when I last interviewed him, still had never spoken to or emailed or texted Donald Trump, but was in the orbit enough on the campaign that he likely spoke to people or communicated with people who communicated with Trump. And that's good enough, because the intel agencies allow themselves to get a wiretap on one person and to go 3 hops to be able to look at communications of anyone who communicated with that person, and anyone who communicated with those people, and anyone who communicated with those people, which gets to be like almost everyone in the country with just 1 or 2 wiretaps. So certainly they were looking at Donald Trump's communications, whether to build a case or just to see what he was doing so that they could frame him and blackmail him, or who knows why, but this was information they were clearly interested in. And Congress has done a poor job at oversight. In part, they're listening to Congress and their staff as well, as we've learned. I think many of them are compromised. I know Steve Perry, who's a member of Congress, who's aggressive about oversight on these sorts of things. They grabbed his cell phone, the FBI, never charged him with anything, but after January 6th, certainly pressured him, made him spend the money to hire a lawyer, threatened him. You know, they have just ways to keep all of these people in line or silent by using, you know, being bullies, basically, with the information that they can have and the things that they can do. And, you know,
oh, go ahead.
well, people don't realize it's impossible to fight them, even if you're innocent. The money that it costs to go up against the industrial, you know, justice complex, you might want to call it, if they decide to target you, people plead guilty all the time that aren't guilty because they simply cannot survive. You know, they can't, the cost and the threat of, hey, and the off chance that you're ultimately convicted, we're going to send you away for life. They plead to something tiny because they're going bankrupt with the, you know, the way that they draw up the charges and make you go through these life changes because you've been accused. It's just a mess. I naively thought that once we had the forensics, which are airtight like a fingerprint, and the government IP addresses illegally in the computer, that you win your case. You know, I thought someone has to apologize, someone has to be held accountable. Well, I come to learn if the Department of Justice doesn't want to apologize and they're going to fight, they can you know, build up hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in costs, which most people can't afford to do, and just keep fighting and fighting to keep you from ever getting to court so that you never can take the steps of discovery and so on. Somehow we managed to get a clerk's default against one of the federal agents involved in one of the operations. I was subjected to numerous ones. I think they're tripping all over each other because there's many going on at one time.
Right.
And so we were waiting because this is the person, the agent, who had acknowledged what he did and had some information to turn over. But he suddenly, before we could have the damages part of the trial, supposedly died and is gone. And so we'll never be able to get the information he could have provided us about the higher ups so that we could then justify discovery, so that we could then go to trial on these forensic, airtight forensic evidence that we have. So yes, it's, I guess, the first and only win by a journalist in a case of government spying, but it's not going to get us to the place where I hoped it would, which was to hold the people accountable who ordered this.
Right.
I think they're doing it to a lot of people.
Me too.
And I argued initially, when I first learned this was happening to me through some inside sources before I even had the forensics done, I said to my bureau chief at CBS when I reported it, you know, I'm not the only one. And he said, you can't be. And from then we learned of a lot of other people, but because business wasn't taken care of when this was exposed initially, I posit that's partly why they were able to do it to Donald Trump and members of Congress since then, and other people even today, because nobody's been held accountable. Well, thank you. My TV show, we started our 10th year. We feed to 43 million TV households every Sunday on CBS, ABC, NBC, Fox, whatever, depending on where you live. You can go to fullmeasure.news if you missed the show or to see the list of stations and times, but you can just watch online like that if it's easier. I try to cross-post my Substacks and almost everything I do at CherylAxon.com.
Great.
And the book is Follow the Science, available anywhere. It was a bestseller in its first week, but only by grassroots and word of mouth, because for obvious reasons, big media outlets are not talking about or going to talk about this book. It really exposes a lot. And so I hope people continue to gravitate to it, give a copy to their friends, and then donate it to the local library so that the word gets out about all of this.
That's great. Yeah.